Live. We'll see if this gets us there. All right, saying we're live.
Let's do it.
Although it's also still doing its loading thing here, so
Man,
we might be doing that thing where we're currently invisible, but people will be able to watch it later.
It's all good, man. I'm excited.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for being here to chat with us a little bit and help people understand why the Public Service Commissioner is important and what that job does and what it should do that's maybe not doing right now.
That's the better question, right? What it should do.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I just got to mute my own Facebook here so it's not talking to me at the same time. Cool.
No problem.
All right, we're thinking we're ready to go. So we got a few commission questions submitted ahead of time on our Athens for Everyone discussion group. But I think I wanted to start by saying, yeah, so welcome everyone. Daniel Blackman is here. He's the Athens for Everyone endorsed candidate in the Democratic primary for Public Service Commissioner. And he's going to tell us what that job does. We endorsed him because we think he offers the clearest vision for how this office can be used to promote environmental justice and economic justice in Georgia. So I wanted to start, if you could just tell us like what the Public Service Commission does and maybe just broadly to start, like how it can be used to advance economic and environmental justice. And then we'll dig into those things in more detail as we go on.
I mean, well, first and foremost, I'd be remiss as the son of a United States Army Ranger who's buried at Georgia National Cemetery to not acknowledge Memorial Day. So for the families that are out here and for those who sacrificed their lives, I want to first acknowledge those folks. I want to acknowledge our first responders and the medical community and all those who have lost their lives in this battle as we've reached the 100,000 mark of deaths with COVID. So the same way how people like my father put their lives on the line and other folks that are buried up there lost their lives to defend our country, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the folks that lost their lives defending our public health and the need for us to do more. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to Athens for Everyone. Thank you for the entirety of Athens and for everybody watching. I'm so excited to be here. For those of you that don't know, the most common question I get is, what does the Public Service Commission do? And it's really simple. When you click on your light switch or when you're cooking, if you have a gas stove, the Public Service Commission regulates your public utilities. The fun thing about the Public Service Commission, even though that's not the most attractive way to position, is everybody has a light bill, right? Whether you have an EMC or you have a MEAG or you have one of the Southern company-owned companies, the Georgia Public Service Commission's specific role is to regulate those utilities and to determine through their hearings how we deploy energy, how we protect the environment, how we protect communities, but more importantly, what we're doing on behalf of ratepayers. So I'll leave it at that because I want the conversation to be a little, deeper into some of the ideas I have. But ladies and gentlemen, I mean, the Public Service Commission is one of those unknown positions that dictates our lives. For senior citizens on a fixed income, they have to determine the amount of money they have to pay for their medication, but also to keep the lights on. For working families and for union workers, same things. And we are currently experiencing a pandemic unlike we have seen in our generation. And folks, I will give kudos to the utility industry. They have done a little to offer relief for folks. So, the Public Service Commission, making sure folks' utilities are not being disconnected, making sure that we're making smart choices, but more importantly, which I'll get into later, making sure that we fundamentally understand how much counties around our state that don't have access to broadband are suffering, especially children and college students that aren't in areas where they can access the internet and have high-speed internet, finish their assignments, and do the work they need to move on further in their matriculation. So again, thank you for having me.
Awesome. I think that's a great overview to start with. And yeah, let's get right into that ratepayer question, right? Because we know the utility bills are one of those regressive parts of our lives in this state, where utility bills are a very significant portion of income for low to middle income people, whereas they're insignificant to folks with a lot of wealth. So yeah, what can you do there to help ease the burden on people, or what's the plan?
Well, first and foremost, last year, for those of you that don't know, if you have Georgia Power, if you have Atlanta Gas and Light, at the end of 2019, we saw 2 mandatory base rate increases. What a base rate increase means is no matter if you cut your power on, lower your power in the summer when it's hotter, you want to lower the amount of air conditioning you use when it's hot, or you want to turn on your heat when it's cold. The base rate means that your rate will rise regardless of the decisions you make on a personal level. And then on top of that, the power that you use to condition your house or to warm your home, that is factored into that as well. So we've seen a tremendous burden on the state of Georgia. One of the things that separates me, because I am in a primary, is I have not only an energy and environmental background, energy policy and environmental justice, but I have a background in civil and human rights. I actually marched with Athens for Everyone a couple of years ago. I've been at several rallies and marches, supported members of this great organization. And, for me, it's really about understanding two things. One is poverty and the second is economics. Poverty in the sense that 1.9 million people in the state of Georgia live at or below the poverty line. Number two, when we think about, utility bills, I've been on the phone with folks all over this state. One of the hardest conversations I had was 3 days ago with a business owner in Albany, Georgia, in Dougherty County. And she had mentioned to me consistent bills between $700 and $900. These are electric bills that folks in rural Georgia are paying for various reasons. They're struggling to pay those bills. So when you think of the Public Service Commission, it's almost disingenuous and inhumane to not think poverty. When you think of COVID crisis with the stimulus package that came out, one of the things that I don't think people realize is at the same time that checks were cut, LIHEAP, which is Low Income Heat and Energy Assistance Program, was funded $900 million. So we're looking at a lot of the challenges, but also the opportunities and making sure that folks aren't overwhelmed and overburdened with their utility bills right now. But in that same space, how do you navigate for poor people, right? If someone's power has been cut off, that's a huge issue. If someone has to get their power cut back on, they have a reconnection fee, that's a huge issue. These are all issues that I feel directly are in alignment with being a good and a successful public service commissioner, but also being in alignment with understanding the needs and the lived experiences that so many people face when folks that are behind closed doors and buildings without walls are making decisions for working families. It's very hard to make those decisions when you don't understand the struggles of a college student, a single parent, or anyone that is living below the poverty line. And I hope my candidacy represents those folks and that we work towards building a public service commission that puts people ahead of profits of the utility companies.
Heck yeah, that sounds great to me. And as I'm thinking about that question, like working toward building a public service commission that does those things, I guess I'm wondering, are you seeing some of your proposals as things that you can do as long as you're elected, or are they things that we're not going to be able to accomplish until we have a majority of people agreeing with those things on the Public Service Commission?
That is an absolutely excellent question, because the last time there was a Democrat at the Public Service Commission was a gentleman by the name of David Burgess, an African-American gentleman out of DeKalb County. He was appointed, not elected, to the Public Service Commission by Governor Roy Barnes. And you're absolutely right. There's another gentleman by the name of Robert Bryant who's running in District 1. And even if Robert and I were to mutually be elected in November, that's still 2 votes against 3, which means we'll be outvoted every time. So here are a few progressive and exciting ideas I have. Number one, we need to turn our technical colleges into spaces for community, civic, and interfaith spaces where we can do ratepayer schools. Michigan State University has an excellent program called the Institute of Public Utilities. I want to do something similar where we activate our community colleges and we activate our historically Black colleges to make sure that we're sharing information that can then be disseminated through civic organizations and churches throughout our communities. And this could be done in mosques and synagogues as well. We need to get the information out, because one of the biggest problems with the Public Service Commission is transparency. To your specific question, I think one of the things we have to consider is, what will I be able to do, right? If I'm there, whether my friend Robert gets elected and I get elected at the same time, or one of us, what can we do? And to me, it's one, even though I would represent North Georgia, so I'm running in District 4. That means I would have pretty much the entirety of North Georgia. And I would be in a position, number one, to make sure that we're speaking to the needs, for instance, of wireless broadband. Access to broadband is critical. I was very fortunate when President Obama was in office to work with Michelle Obama on her Let's Move campaign, which was a campaign to fight against childhood obesity. One of the things I learned through that process was about food deserts and how many areas don't have access to healthy food. Well, the crisis we're facing in rural America, and especially all over Georgia right now, is we're facing information deserts. Now, I will give Governor Kemp the credit due and AT&T, because they have deployed 500 wireless hotspots around the state, but that's just not enough. You got 159 counties in the state of Georgia. You have countless young men and women that are, in college. My cousin goes to Georgia Southern University, and she struggled every day to make sure she could balance having access to the internet and submitting her work in a timely manner. Too many young people are sitting at McDonald's parking lots and Chick-fil-A's to just use the internet. So one of the things we can do is advocate for more and work with our state legislature. Number two, I'm not going to be working solely from 244 Washington Street. We need to be in Athens. We need to be in Raymond. We need to be in Cherokee. We need to be in Forsyth and Lowndes and Savannah, Chatham County. We need to be all over the state, making sure that we're informing people of the decisions that are made. Just like when we had this recent hearing in December, those were a series of public hearings where the public could give their voice. But the average person, say you're from Columbus, Georgia, where I grew up in Muskogee County, you may not have been able to make a 2-hour drive to Atlanta, or you're in Chatham County and you're 4.5 hours away, or wherever you are. We need to make sure we open up those spaces. So even though our progressive and climate-driven ideas and decisions we make are going to be challenged by the other 3 commissioners until we can change those seats, but we've got to do what we can to educate the community, inform the community, and build a space where individuals that are voting are more educated about those who regulate their utilities.
Cool. So I'm hearing there's both some big long-term goals that you're going to need a majority in order to accomplish, but also some major steps you can take towards there in terms of maybe some policy changes, but especially bring this information, making sure people know what's at stake in these bodies in general, and give people the resources they need so they can fight for better opportunities related.
Absolutely correct. And just so people know, the Public Service Commission is a 6-year term. So even though we'll probably spend our first year or two busting our butts and rolling up our sleeves, we're going to lay the infrastructure. We're going to line ourselves up with green policies, and we're going to make sure that we're not just talking about them, but we're weaponizing our counties and our civic organizations to fight and advocate for these policies, especially with their elected officials.
Cool. So I want to follow up on the broadband vision you're talking about, just to get a little more detail, because I think a lot of times people hear, like, we want to expand broadband, and that's absolutely the case. Like, I don't think there's any progressive-minded person who disagrees with that. When we're talking about that, are we talking about, I guess there's a few different ways maybe of approaching that. Are we talking about incentives for private companies to extend broadband? Are we talking about public infrastructure that would then be used by private companies to deliver the service? Are we talking about a fully public ISP? Like, yeah, what does—
It has to be a combination. Yeah, it has to be a combination of infrastructure and incentives. And that's a part of our plan. Like, AT&T is headquartered right here in Atlanta, so we need to make sure that, one, we're incentivizing companies to do the work. What COVID has taught us, and I mean this with all due respect to every other challenge we face, but for my position specifically, what COVID has shown all of us is that we are not connected. Our small businesses are not connected the way they should be. Our schools aren't, our colleges aren't. So I think, number one, we incentivize these carriers to offer the infrastructure that's needed. Again, I would like to see a more expanded and aggressive program similar to what was launched by Governor Kemp and AT&T. They have, they've deployed 500 wireless hotspots in areas. Well, I would like to see that number tripled or even quadrupled within the next year. Who's to say our kids start back school in August, right? We might not see kids going back to school, and I could be wrong, but what if kids don't go back to school till October, right? Like, what are we gonna do in the summer months if we're not making critical infrastructure investments right now? And this would be a message that I'm saying directly to Governor Kemp. If Governor Kemp is not on the phone with our Senate and with our Congress in DC and with the president right now, talking about getting investments, which is your second part of the question, which is investing into infrastructure. If he's not on the phone now trying to find every single carrier, provider, legislation, and every single penny, nickel, and dollar that he can scrape up to make sure that rural counties are not left out, then we're gonna have a problem. Because this issue, past the incentives for the businesses, the infrastructure has to be built out in every aspect of Georgia. In our rural areas, our coastal areas, our mountainous areas, like many of the mountainous areas in Blue Ridge and around our state that are on the Appalachian Trail, we've got to start thinking about the areas that are left out of the conversation. No pun to Atlanta, but we've got to make a policies that extend beyond Metro Atlanta and go all over our state.
Now, yeah, so as I'm thinking about extending to these parts of the state that are particularly remote and don't have access now, I'm thinking about like the Postal Service UPS comparison we've been hearing a lot about right now, which is where like people talk about, oh, the Postal Service doesn't run at a profit. But that's because it guarantees service to everyone, right? It's a public good that we've decided everyone should have access to. So is there a role, I guess, for, folks have charter in Atlanta or in Athens or something? Is there a role for like a directly publicly owned, I don't know, like a Georgia ISP or something, like a publicly owned alternative to these private companies, these private but publicly regulated private companies, for rural Georgia?
Yeah, I think everything is on the table, but it takes people like us to have these discussions to gain the momentum.
Mhm.
You and I both know as a candidate, I can come up here and make a million promises and can't commit to one. The current space that we're in right now, I don't believe offers us the ability to do that right now. Now, can we build the conversation up, make it an issue that Democrats carry into November? But see, here's the thing, and before I go into that second part about November, so my Democratic colleagues that are out here, whether you're a candidate or you're a Democratic chair, we've got to be talking about this in and out of an election season. This can't be because the president's on the ballot or because we've got a campaign. We've got to educate our Democrats in counties and in cities, rural, mountainous areas all over consistently. So to your point, we've got to educate people about what that concept means to have our own ISP. We need to make sure people understand that. We need to advocate for it. And maybe we need to model what Athens for Everyone did as a coalition and build coalitions or even support your organization to be able to go to other areas and do it. I do not believe right now we're in a position to be able to accomplish that, but I would like to see something down the line similar where we can make utilities more competitive and give people an opportunity to really support the kind of systems that would benefit them more.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that idea that we could think of maybe as like a public option for internet or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool. So
man, you sound like you might be able to run for this position one day,
man. Just learning from you. So I want to follow up a little bit on this, on the environmental side of this. And so we got a specific question that I thought is really good. So like, what are your thoughts about getting Georgia to adopt a net metering policy like South Carolina has? And if you could explain what that is, because I'm sure you can explain it more clearly than I can, where residents get paid for, like, if you have solar panels on your roof, right? Like, how would that work? And is that something we can accomplish?
Yeah, so I mean, what most people need to realize, I believe the year was like 2019, the Public Service Commission, I think they approved somewhere like up to 5,000 solar per customer. And if you don't know, net metering is simply a system that's in place in which solar panels or other renewable energy generators can basically connect us to a public utility grid, right? So the reason why it's so important is because when you think of solar, and this goes back to the question that you mentioned earlier, I'm all for solar, right? I think we need solar. I supported Solarize Athens when they were doing this work, 5-6 years ago. The problem is, number one, the average person doesn't have $10,000 to $15,000 to put on top of their own house, let alone if you're a renter, how do you have access to it? So I think we need to explore ideas around, community solar, for example, where we can look at, having that, because access points, really, to go back to poverty, is where we're really facing these challenges. I don't want to just be the public service commissioner for the solar industry. I want to be the public service commissioner for accessibility, right? It's great for us to talk about solar, but if everyone doesn't have access to solar, what is the difference in access to solar versus access to anything else that would have a public benefit? We need to make sure we look at it across the board. But what I'll say to answer that question, number one, is we've got to look at low and moderate income barriers to entry. That's first and foremost. A lot of folks just can't really access the capital. They've got, low income communities don't have the capital, nor do they know about the tax credits and the other opportunities, which goes back to my first point about information. Secondly, we've got to look at an insufficient tax burden, because one of the things that I don't think people realize when you're talking about net metering and community solar and all these areas is if you're not eligible for some programs that exist, there may very well be a great program, but we've got to look at eligibility requirements, right? Because again, we cannot create systems that do not create pathways out of poverty for low income and moderate income families, or for individuals that just may not be eligible. You shouldn't be locked out because there are one or two things that block you from living a better life. And then lastly, I think we need to do a better job of familiarizing people with terms like net metering, community solar. There are a lot of folks that don't participate because they don't know. And there are a lot of people that want to participate that don't have access. So one of the things I think we need to do with the Public Service Commission, at least on my end, is I'd like to see us increase that number from 5,000 to about 15,000. We need to make sure that we can increase the capacity, but we need to do like first-time home buyer programs do, consider everyone's situation and make sure that a percentage, if you're, and I'll use a real estate construction example, if you're building mixed use community in an area and you're trying to prevent gentrification, usually what they'll do is a percentage of that will stay at fair market value. We need to make sure we're creating the same process for folks that want to invest into solar. If you're at a certain income level, if you're not able to be eligible, there should be an alternative for entry so that more people can participate. Hope that helps with the question you asked.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about, yeah, the barriers that exist toward using this office, or how much power, weighing how much power this office of Public Service Commissioner has to accomplish our environmental goals of climate change mitigation versus the power of the legislature, right? Because the Public Service Commissioner has some autonomy, but you're also dealing within the framework, right? You guys can't pass a Green New Deal. You can't pass spending on your own like the legislature can. So I think I'm wondering, is that net metering, or is there something else that you would say is like the biggest priority that you can do, that the Public Service Commission, like what's the best thing the Public Service Commission could do to fight climate change?
Well, I would push back, because I'm not your traditional candidate, nor will I be your traditional elected official. I don't think that I should be limited to the powers of the Public Service Commission. I think that I can pick up the phone and get whether it's getting Stacey Abrams on the phone or it's getting, you know, a mayor of Columbus involved. Like, it doesn't matter. You know, we need to start thinking about doing our job and then going outside of the boundaries of our job to the fullest extent that it's ethical. Okay. In other words, I'm not going to do the job of a county commissioner, but I'm going to meet with county commissioners. You see, what's the problem is right now with our Public Service Commission is they are overly accessible to the utility industry and the utility lobbyists, and they're under accessible to the people. And that's a huge problem. So to answer your question, there are two things I think we could focus on right now. Number one, increasing the opportunity for low and moderate income families, because ratepayers are hurting, man. I mean, when you think of 36 million people in the US have filed for unemployment. Look, the number two request that churches, and I know this from speaking to pastors and synagogues and mosques, the number two request behind rental or mortgage assistance is utility assistance. That's the number two request across the board. Pastor, I need my lights cut on. Bishop, I need you to help me because my gas is about to be cut off. We need to, number one, put safeguards in place that can promote that. And one of my ideas to make sure we work on that is, even though it may be superficial to some, we need a ratepayers bill of rights. We need to make sure that there is a covenant and a commitment that puts the ratepayers of these utility companies ahead of making their shareholders profits. That's number one. When you look at Plant Vogtle right now, that is a legislative issue that Democrats and Republicans voted on in 2009. So the way we fix that is to make sure there are no more fixed burdens that come from that construction onto the ratepayer. We've seen it time and time again, and we've got to do a better job of that. As a Public Service Commissioner, I believe that we can work with legislature to make sure that there are more protections in place for working families. Okay, that's number one. And again, to that point, that even means our senior citizens. The Public Service Commission can convene meetings with the AARP to make sure that we're working with the AARP to provide those opportunities. Secondly, as a Public Service Commissioner, this may seem a little unorthodox to some people, but one of the main areas that is one of the key and most critical parts of my candidacy is creating a workforce of the future. Okay, this workforce consists of, it's three-part. Number one, making sure that we're working with the unions so that they understand that going into a new green economy does not mean you're losing your job. We want to make a transition that preserves the opportunities in place and take us more into the future, whether that means solar installation or it means an array of jobs that we can attract to come to the state. We need to get our unions involved. Number two, I mentioned it earlier. If we're not using our technical and community colleges and our historically Black colleges or our minority serving institutions as places to recruit the talent, then we're missing it. And I'm gonna give you an example. You brought up a very good question about what I can do if I'm outvoted by the other commissioners. Well, imagine if we had a workforce, right, that works with Georgia Power, that works with our electric membership corporations, that works with utilities around the state, that have the same progressive ideas and values that go into board meetings, that serve as managers. They can now, from within these organizations, dictate what that looks like. One of the things that I want to do, and I know, again, this sounds a little, like a challenge, but I believe that I can do more than just overseeing hearings and advocating for clean energy practices. I want to make sure that in my 6 years, once I leave that position, or if I am fortunate enough to get elected for another term, if that time comes, I want to be someone that can say a part of my legacy is we built a space in the state of Georgia that surpassed K through 12 education, but went into college, and we have now created an influx of young men and women that are not leaving the state because they can't find jobs, that are staying right here at home because the clean energy jobs that are fueled in the South are happening right here in Georgia. Georgia has no reason, having Atlanta as its epicenter, to not be leading the finance charge and the infrastructure investment charge in the entirety of the Southeastern United States. We can do it, and we have the workforce to be able to develop that kind of path.
And yeah, I want to talk a little bit about how we push on the utilities to, for example, how do we stimulate those jobs that you're talking about wanting to do? And I think I want to step back a little bit to talk about how utilities work in Georgia, right? So these are private companies. Georgia Power is a private company, but it's granted a monopoly by the government in exchange for the ability to regulate it, basically. So it's like they invest the money, they get the profits, and they get to be the only one who sells electricity in these areas or whatever. And in exchange for that, we say, these are the rules you have to play by. Is that the basic outline of how that works? So I guess, like, how much can we push what those rules are, or we ask them to play by? For example, can the Public Service Commission say, you have to get to 100% renewable energy by 2035? Or another one on if we're talking about ratepayers, during a crisis, does the Public Service Commission have the ability to say, we're having a 3-month utility moratorium for low-income families that you can't charge them during this time? Or how close can we get to
so here's the thing, so we don't confuse it. Those are primarily legislative issues. However, the Public Service Commission, for instance, on your moratorium question, because they work directly with utilities, can push and advocate for that. The Public Service Commission also has a staff that is dedicated to making sure that we're ensuring the protections of communities as a whole. One of the biggest mistakes we've made in the history of the Georgia Public Service Commission was when Governor Sonny Perdue was in office and he cut the Consumer Utility Council. That council was in place to be a watchdog for ratepayers and to protect the interests of those individuals, okay? So the challenge that, one of the things that we can do to offset that, to your point, is we can work with our legislators around that issue, because here's the thing, we're not gonna break up Georgia Power, right? Like, I mean, it's just like, and I'm the kind of person that I'm very direct. I would never say anything to anyone that we weren't in the ability to do, or say something to motivate folks and say, thank you for your vote, I appreciate it, and we're gonna move on to something else. Now, what we could do, which I think would be extremely important, is number one, that goes back to the education question. We've got to make sure that we're looking at the things that can be changed and shifted over a period of time. And I think a few of those things that can shift is, like, being more accountable. I live in Forsyth County, Georgia, okay? In Forsyth County, Georgia, I have what's called an EMC. I'm a voting member, okay? So that means that when there are decisions made, I, as a member, have the ability and the right to speak into that. With the Public Service Commission, the difference is when they have their hearings, you can sign up on a piece of paper and you can make a public comment, and that public comment goes into the personal record, okay, the overall record of the hearing that was taken. What I think we should be doing a better job of is putting more consumer advocacy organizations in a position of power that can then have the ability, not just from a voting standpoint, but when you look at nuclear plant Vogtle, we'll be paying for that for the next 60 years, okay? The thing with Plant Vogtle, though, is if you get an itemized bill, which most people don't get, and you look on your itemized bill, you're gonna see something called NCCR, which is Nuclear Cost Recovery, okay? Everyone is paying that. Now, here's the thing. If schools knew that they have paid about $10,000 to $15,000 in the last 10 years, if churches knew they paid the last $10,000 to $15,000 in the last 10 years, and if individuals knew they paid about $1,000, then we would start pushing back, asking questions, and holding them more accountable. We've got to take that angle first, but then get legislators elected. I cannot stress enough. You mentioned, I think House District 117 and 119 is what you guys are working on. We've got to work with those folks right now to make sure that they are thinking about those policies so that the day they're elected, they're working on policies to give ratepayers more power.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a lot of this like as like a team approach, right? That this isn't something that one person can do from one position, but it takes both legislators passing legislation that gives the kind of relief to ratepayers that we want to see, and it takes the action on climate change we want to see, and then it takes the Public Service Commission to make sure these things are implemented correctly, that they're being followed by the utilities, and to give a real voice to the consumers so they can.
That is correct.
Fight on these things. Awesome. Let's see if I have another question right here yet.
You're doing a great job, man. I'm telling you, I'm gonna vote for you one day for this position.
I'm learning all about it right now. And I do think that one of the interesting things coming from an organization like Athens for Everyone that's devoted and talks explicitly about really transformative, huge structural changes in our society. It's always interesting, like the steps that it takes to get there, right? So something like the Public Service Commission that doesn't have the power to do that all on its own, or like all our work in the county commission that can do some sorts of criminal justice reform, but can't change the whole system on its own. The way that we can make material progress on these things, make real changes that make a difference in people's lives, while also talking about the bigger things that we can't do yet, but that we need to push for as a society. So it's not like, when we've empowered something like the Consumer Utility Council again, that itself is progress that helps towards something, but that we also don't consider that like an endpoint, right? It's not, okay, it's time to rest our, take our shoes off and go home now. That's just a step toward winning the bigger changes that we want to win in the long term.
That's right.
So I really enjoyed the way.
And just real quickly, you did mention about certain policies, and I want to be very clear. When President Obama was in office, he presented the Clean Power Plan, which was a legislative from the federal level that he wrote, and that legislation was to cut emissions in the U.S. by 30% by the year 2025. There are some aggressive things we can do, but again, the key word you mentioned was team effort. There's no way that we're going to be able to accomplish these things if we're not bringing everyone into the fold. And one quick example I'll give you, there's a woman named Debbie Dooley, right? Debbie Dooley and I politically have so much that we have that's different. She is a Tea Party member of the Georgia Tea Party. I'm a Democrat that believes in progressive values and social justice and social impact. But we came together because we fundamentally understood that a part of freedom, a part of democracy was our ability to choose and our ability to be able to advocate on behalf of ratepayers. And so one of the things we can do that I think is so valuable for all of your viewers to understand is that this is not just about us against them. This is about working with folks to understand opportunities that exist that we can all tie into that have a greater benefit, not just for us, but for long term. Because I'll tell you right now, man, poor income communities, not just Black and Latino folks, they're struggling with clean air and clean water. We talked about Flint a lot over the past few years with environmental justice issues, but we're not talking about the Savannah River. We're not talking about Juliet, Georgia. We're not talking about Burke County, Georgia. And until you start talking about the areas of low and moderate income families and minority communities that are adversely hit by environmental racism and environmental injustices, then we're not doing our job.
Yeah, I think I want to follow up a little bit on that idea of, right, it's not, we talk a lot of, it's not us versus them, right? It's not about like native born workers versus immigrants, obviously, or like our society, really the framework we need isn't about like Republican voters versus Democratic voters. That's like a false attempt, I think, a lot of times to split the working class or whatever. We talk about the idea that there is a real tension in the society between the interests of most people, right, the 99% or whatever, and the interests of the few on top. And I guess I'm wondering, when we have this unjust energy system that's unjust both in terms of its impact on the planet because it contributes to climate change, and unjust on low and middle class families because of the burden of paying for utilities and stuff, do you like, there isn't us that's affected here. And I wonder, like, who's the them, who's responsible, like who's our target? Is Georgia Power like the enemy here? Are they the people we should be looking at and saying like, oh, they're the ones doing wrong and this is why we're suffering? Or do we think it's like the political power systems that have implemented policies that have led to our utilities being too high and too fossil fuel dependent. Does that make sense? Like whose responsibility is it for the fact that we don't have a just energy economy?
Well, to say Georgia Power is the enemy, capitalism would be the enemy, right? I mean, like we understand fundamentally they're a part of a structure to make a profit, to ensure the shareholders of that company continue to make a profit, right? So I think that is similar to the matador, right? If you have that red cape, you don't hit the cape, you hit the person holding it. And the people, the individuals, the organizations that are hurting us goes back to Citizens United. There's too much money in politics. When you have the CEO of Georgia Power that makes $13,000 a day to run that company, that is a tremendously large amount of money. And there's a quote that says it's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. So it's very hard for us to say that they're going to be the enemy. What my push would be is twofold. I have methods for every ideology I have, because I don't think it's fair to just say we got to get money out of politics. Well, how? Right? So the first thing that I would say, number one, is we need to make sure from an economic standpoint, we understand the importance of money in politics and how many lobbyists are working against the interests of progressives, of regular folks, working families, folks that are convincing people in Mississippi and Louisiana that are Republican and poor. They're convincing them that those policies aren't hurting them, they're helping them. This administration, my opponent that I'm running against in November, the Republican, his name is Bubba McDonald. He's a good guy. Guy's working for solar. He's out there fighting, but he hasn't spoken against the administration in the White House right now that has not only defunded the EPA, not only discredited our sciences, not only denied climate change. How can you say that you have a 5-person commission that is for the interest of the people if you're working against the whole interest of our communities? We have to begin to speak about those issues. And I want to make sure that we understand we can't look at it as there's this boogeyman behind the door. We've got to look at the complete system. And that's why one of the first things I did when we went online was I made a commitment. I took the pledge to not accept a dime from the fossil fuel industry. We have to hold our elected officials accountable. There's a quote, well, not even a quote, a saying that if you want to find someone's interest, and you follow the money. When you pull the disclosure statements of some of our best friends that are elected officials and you look on their disclosures, they're taking money from a lot of folks they're regulating. And I'm against that personally. So I think the first thing we have to do is look at the structure, and the way we push back about it is looking at the sources of the money and why we're in the position we're in. But then secondly, we've got to put more safeguards in place. And I'll admit, I don't have all the answers, but one of the things that I want to do from day one, when you look at coal ash in the state of Georgia and the coal ash cleanup, $500 million of the $1.9 billion that Georgia Power requested, 1.7 or 1.8 is what they received. When you look at that problem, one of the biggest challenges is Georgia Power's coal-fired plants that polluted many of our drinking water sources, like what I mentioned earlier with Juliet, Georgia. Many of those individuals are now paying for what Georgia Power should pay for. Georgia Power's, I would look at them as pay your fair share. Okay, if they have created a space for environmental challenges and environmental injustice, they need to be on the hook for the bill, not the ratepayer that's getting their rates increased right now. We've got to change that mindset.
That sounds
I think
great.
I answered the question.
Oh no, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking about, just following the money. Like we got the sheriff's race right now, Democratic primary for a sheriff in Athens, where the incumbent, his campaign's been funded by the same companies that are profiting off inmates' phone calls, profiting off their meals, and the bail bonds and industry. And I think it's very illustrative of where people's priorities are and how they're going to go.
Now, I will say this, because it's easy to point the finger at Georgia Power, and they should. Okay, let me be very clear. Georgia Power and the Public Service Commission have made decisions that have crippled many of our communities for a long time. But I will say this, we've got to make sure that we're doing our part in educating and informing our general population. Because if most people, and here's the thing, I've got Republicans that have called me on the phone saying, hey, I'm rooting for you, and if you make it to November, I'm going to vote for you. And when I ask them why, their number one answer is because I'm a fiscal conservative. I don't agree with you everything on social progressive politics, but fiscally, I don't believe it's right for any company to take more of my hard-earned money out of my pocket for their mistakes. And when you speak to people about being fiscally responsible, and you look at a nuclear power plant that was supposed to be about 12 to 14 billion dollars, it is now 27.9 billion dollars and years behind schedule, then it makes you think for a second, what are our priorities, where are they, and what can we do to change that narrative?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate that. And basically wondering if there's other things you want to tell us about the position or your plans for it that we haven't covered yet before we kind of get into a little closing.
Well, you know, I think people need to understand the importance that you play. If you are listening to me right now, if you are listening to this at a later date, we have to be more informed and we have to have an agenda. I know Governor Deval Patrick out of Massachusetts. We've known him for a while. I was born in Boston, Massachusetts. My father joined the military. We moved to Vicenza, Italy, and I went from Vicenza, Italy to South Georgia. That's a totally different story about the culture shift that I experienced moving to the Deep South. But what I will say is Governor Patrick shared a story with me one time about, he said at the height of the police shootings in the United States, his office had been protested when he was the governor of Massachusetts. And he said, you know, Daniel, I walked into my office every day and I walked past people protesting my office. And one day I invited them up and I said, you come into my office. He said, what is it that you want? And he said that the gentleman that had been organizing the protest didn't have an answer for him. So we don't know. We just want the shootings to stop, right? And I think we have to not be so reactory, because we're going to have to be in those rooms to negotiate. And I want people to understand who I am and my integrity. I can't throw Georgia Power under the bus, not because I will not call them out when they're wrong, but because when I become a public service commissioner, I have to take the agenda of Athens for Everyone, the agenda of the Urban League, the agendas of all the organizations around the state, whether they be the NAACP or Athens for Everyone or Solarize Athens, you name it, Georgia Sierra Club. I've got to take those ideas and go into a room, maybe a hostile room, and negotiate, not based on my feelings, but what's right. And that is what's most critical that I want people to know about this position and every other position. I am an environmental justice advocate by heart. I have been a civil and human rights advocate since I was 19 years old, working under a gentleman by the name of Gerald Durley, Reverend Joseph Lowry, and Maynard Jackson. Those are individuals that helped to raise me when I was a young man, got me involved in civil and human rights and poverty for the entirety of my 20s. Creating and supporting policies that lift people out of poverty had been my foundation. When Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out and I had a chance to meet Al Gore and sit down with Al Gore, I told Al Gore to his face, with all due respect, sir, African Americans and low-income families are not as concerned about polar ice caps melting as they are about their local light bills and their utility bills and the water they drink. And he chuckled, not in a condescending way. He said, Daniel, you're right. And he said, we've got to do more to bring communities of color into this conversation. So I want people to know that my fight from day one has been environmental justice, civil and human rights, and making sure that we're creating equity. If you don't remember anything else about Daniel Blackman, I want you to remember this. This guy is about equity, about leveling the playing field, whether that means people having access to solar or people just being able to be in a space where they have a fundamental ability to not have to compromise their cost of living to keep their lights on.
And yeah, totally. I'm with you also when you're talking about the way that, you know, Georgia Power is operating in a system that they didn't create either, right? Like ultimately, our society is structured by political decisions that decide how capitalist firms work, for example, or how utilities are provided in the first place. And like, we're not going to win the world we want to see, we believe, by convincing for-profit corporations to be more kind-hearted. That's not their job. Our job is, the job ultimately for all of us is to win political systems that create the incentives that are right in the first place so that it's working for all of us. And that takes political power, which means that kind of popular education you're talking about, so that people understand what we're fighting for, are able to fight for it, and then winning the structural power over those levers so that we can enact the policies that build the world we want to see.
Agreed.
And yeah, I really appreciate the core of equity in every decision, right? Because as we know, in all these positions, your power is neither limitless nor is it nothing, right? There are things we can do to move ourselves closer to that goal. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your goals for that. And yeah, we're super happy to be supporting you in this election. So
I'm happy to have the support, man.
Yeah. So when folks are sending in your absentee ballots, if you haven't sent in your absentee ballot request, please do it this week. The ballots are coming from Arizona, so they're taking a while to get here for a lot of folks. And also, if you vote in person, you can do that early voting now or on June 9th. And of course, remember your mask and your hand sanitizer and all that. Do you want to pitch a little bit of how people can get involved or where they can give you some money possibly if they want to do that?
Well, I might need to put you on the payroll, man, because I thank you for reminding me. You know, in all seriousness, I started this campaign because I fundamentally believe that we're at an intersection in our society. And the slogan for my campaign is Together for Tomorrow. My grandfather was a diplomat for the United Nations, and the United Nations during the time of his service had sustainable goals. And they had a saying that was, we are well able to meet the needs of the present without compromising future generations to meet their own needs. I am on the ballot because I believe in the future of Georgia and the future of our society as a whole, both in the United States and around the world. It starts locally. It starts with the Public Service Commission. It starts with our house, our state house, and our state legislatures. That's where it begins. If you want to contact me and find out more about who I am as an individual, you can go online to danielforgeorgia.com. That's Daniel, D-A-N-I-E-L, F-O-R, and then Georgia.com. You can go online, you can learn about my policies, you can donate online. This has been a tremendously hard challenge for every candidate around the state, whether you're running for U.S. Senate or you're running for county commissioner. The bottom line is it's very hard to raise money during this time. So if you want to give $1, if you want to give $5, if you want to give 50, no matter what you contribute, we will put that directly towards getting this word out. And my commitment is, regardless of the outcome of the primary, I am going to be a fighter, an advocate, and a supporter for our community, for Athens, for each and every one of the 159 counties in Georgia. Lastly, what I'll say, if you have a personal question for me, you can email me directly at danielforgeorgia@gmail.com. We specifically set it up that way because we wanted to separate it for personal questions and information people need. That's DANIEL F-O-R Georgia@gmail.com. And I thank you all so much. Athens for Everyone, you're an amazing organization. I'm so elated and appreciative not only have your endorsement, but to have the opportunity to speak to your members and to the entirety of those watching on Facebook. I really appreciate it. It's people like you that are going to make us a better society. Oh, and one more thing, if I can add, we're entering into a hurricane season. I want people to understand something. We mentioned a lot of the direct impacts that the Public Service Commission have. What we didn't mention, and what I think is critical, is while we're sheltering in place, this is said to be one of the hottest summers and one of the most extreme weather patterns that we've seen in a decade. So my advice to all of you is to continue to shelter in place. And we, as a Public Service Commission, once I'm elected, will make sure we do everything in our power to have plans in place to protect the interests and the safeties of our communities, and also to maintain the safety and reliability of your utility. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, talking to us, and look forward to struggling with you for the years to come until we build the society we all want and deserve. This video will also be up on our Facebook page so people can share it and watch it afterwards. It might take like a half an hour to get there, but it'll be there. Thank you, Daniel. Good luck. And we'll see you for the general election, right?
There you go, man. Daniel Blackman, District 4. And come on, man, let's work. If you want a phone bank, if you want to help me out, reach out to me. We'll post it in this message thread. Get involved, work, and let's make sure Democrats around this state are elected so that we can win the future. Thank you all so much. See you in November.
Have a great one.
Thank you.